This video is the fourth in the series on the book Chess Strategy Move by Move by the author Adam Hunt. It will be on typical pawn structures that arise in games, beginning by discussing the benefits of gaining a space advantage with the pawns, then touching upon pawn breaks, before looking at play involving the isolated queen's pawn, backwards pawn, and hanging pawns, and ending by talking about the minority attack. First, we'll look at the symbol position to show what is meant by a side having a space advantage. We can see here that while black's pawns are only advanced 1 rank, the white pawns are advanced 2 ranks, and we can see how this difference leads to differences in development and piece activity. Whereas white has the natural f3 and c3 squares for the knights, and also the bishops can go to d3 and e3, black doesn't have access to the same kinds of squares on their side. The knights can't go to f6 or c6 and have to make do with the d7 and e7 squares, and the bishops also have to make do with the e7 and d7 squares since they don't have open diagonals. Because of the lack of space, black is significantly more cramped and has more difficulty activating their pieces. A space advantage with the pawns can also facilitate an attack, which I will show using the short example in the French defense. Going forward, we have this e5 move which establishes the pawn structure in the center, where it's fairly locked, and the pawn on e5 helps give white a space advantage, controlling the d6 and f6 squares and preventing black from moving the e-pawn. Going further forward, we can see white taking even more space with this f4 move, and after bishop d3, we can see that white has access to this square because of the space advantage, whereas black's light squared bishop is stuck on c8 and can't really get out at the moment. Knight f3, another straightforward developing move, and after knight c6, castles. After castles here by black, we have this nice and thematic move, bishop takes h7, the Greek gift sacrifice, since after king takes h7, there's knight to g5 check, supported by the f4 pawn that was pushed earlier, allowing the knight to establish itself in the enemy territory. If the king goes back to g8, there's queen to h5 threatening checkmate on h7, and the only option for black is to play queen takes g5 and give up the queen. Because black is so cramped and white has a space advantage, black can't bring over any forces towards the king side, such as the bishop on c8 and the knight on d7. Additionally, if we go back to this position, if the king walks up to g6, because of white's space advantage, there is another avenue for attack, this diagonal from d3 to h7, allowing more pressure to be put on the black king, and we can see lines opening up, and white having fairly simple development. The f4 pawn allows the knight to maintain its post on g5, where it controls a lot of important squares in the enemy territory, and we can see how black cannot move the knights to a useful square e5, and the light squared bishop on c8 can't get out. Now, before moving on to talk about specific structures, it's important to take a quick look at pawn breaks. To quote the author, "A pawn break, to put it simply, is the offer to exchange a pair of pawns, usually in order to open up a file. Pawn breaks are especially important in closed positions to activate your pieces." I've highlighted all of the pawn breaks for each side with arrows, however it's important to note that not all pawn breaks are equal and you need to choose them carefully. First, we can take a look at this a4 pawn break from white. However, after b takes a4, the rook on b7 is activated for black. Going back to the original position, we can see that the b4 pawn break just isn't possible, it's too heavily controlled by black. If we look at this f4 pawn break, after e takes f4, we can see that this e5 square is opened up for the knight, only serving to activate a piece for black, and this is of course ignoring the fact that currently f4 is impossible due to it just getting taken. And again, if we go back to the original position, if we look at this h4 move to try and go for the h5 pawn break, we can see how the g4 pawn is now unstable and could potentially be lost, even if it's defended in the future. Conversely, if we look at black's pawn breaks, there's potentially this f5 pawn break, where after this move f5, maybe after some trades, we can see both bishops opening up, and we can see potentially the black knight on f7 moving further forward into the white position, and black isn't really making any concessions, such as with white's f4 pawn break, so this would be a good pawn break for black. Because of the difference in the quality of pawn breaks, black is significantly more comfortable in this position. The isolated queen pawn, which potentially sounds like a very specific structure, is actually a common one and arises from many openings. Here we can see a queen's gambit decline, and after we move forward a little bit, after this move c takes d4, e takes d4, we can see white is left with this isolated queen pawn. Because they have no pawns to support them, isolated queen pawns can be a very big weakness and liability, especially in the endgame. This may lead someone to wonder then, why would you accept the isolated queen pawn as white instead of just taking with the knight in this situation, or the queen? However, if we look at this from white's perspective, we can see some potential reasons why you would take this. First, this pawn being on d4 controls important c5 and e5 squares, which black maybe would have utilized, especially because the pawn on e6 blocks black's light-squared bishop's development. We can see here that the pawn being on d4 is very important for preventing black from breaking out with e5. Additionally, the pawn being isolated means that the c-file and the e-file are both open for white. Because white has no pawns around the isolated queen pawn, they have a lot of open lines that can be used for attacking. Because the pawn controls e5, the knight can come from f3 to e5 and be useful in attacking, something that will be relevant in the second game that I show. And lastly, the pawn on d4 can push itself to d5 and either trade itself off or be used to just break open some lines, which further helps an attack. However, this first game is going to mainly focus on how to play against the isolated queen pawn. As we move forward, we can see that after this trade, instead of playing queen takes e7, black plays knight takes e7, trying to control the square in front of the isolated queen pawn and preventing it from trading itself off. Further forward, we can see knight f6 also doing the same, and we can see bishop d7, and if we go a few more moves forward, bishop c6 does happen, also controlling the d5 square. Moving back a little bit, we can see here that after white played knight to e4, black played knight takes e4. Now it may seem weird, why would you give up a piece controlling the square in front of the isolated queen pawn, and now we're bringing in another piece for white. However, black welcomes trades, since the closer you get to an endgame, the more this isolated queen pawn is a liability, and the less white can use the pawn for attacking chances. Now after bishop to c6, there's this trade, and white plays rook to c3, with an important note that if white had actually traded on c6, it would have been best to play b takes c6, and now we can see that all of white's forces are concentrated on that d5 square, making it impossible to trade off that pawn, and it will probably be lost. However, white played rook to c3, and as we move further forward, we can see black moving all the pieces around to create this battery along the d-file, forcing white to use all of their forces to defend the isolated queen pawn. If we move forward just a little more, we can see queen to c6 offering up a trade, with an important note that if queen takes c6, black actually would have won the pawn by force, since after knight takes c6, white doesn't have the forces to defend it, and would have to give it up. And we can see the sample line, d5, knight b4, and the pawn gets won. Things are traded down into an endgame where black is better. So white avoids the queen trade by playing queen to f4, and here we can see knight d5 blockading the pawn and fully making it so that the pawn cannot advance. Black continues to apply pressure to the pawn, here inducing a trade, and we can see how all of white's forces are concentrated on defending this one pawn, whereas black's pieces are significantly more active. We can see white trying to get some activity by inducing queen takes d4, and then after this series of trades, there is this rook takes b7, and things have pretty much equaled out. However, of course, black doesn't allow that and just moves the queen over. After white then offers a trade with the idea of queen takes c3 and then b takes c3, fixing the pawn structure somewhat, black plays this move queen to d7, and we can see that there is a pin along the d-file that black will try to exploit by playing e5. There is a little more pressure on the pawn, and if we just keep going forward, we can see that eventually, after more trades, black plays this move queen to e8, threatening rook to e1, which would be devastating, winning the queen, and as such, white takes here, black takes here, and we can see that even though the pawn has been traded off, black has a lot of activity, the rook is on the second rank, and white's king is extremely weak. And just a few moves later, white resigned. So even though black didn't win the pawn outright, they used the pressure they built up on the pawn over time to eventually convert it into an overwhelming activity advantage. The important points in this game are that when you're faced with an isolated queen pawn, you want to control the square in front of it so that it can't trade itself off. Then, you want to use as many of your forces to put pressure on the pawn and force the other side to allocate resources defending it. If you've built up enough forces, there may be a pin along the file that the isolated queen pawn is on that you can use a pawn to make use of. And lastly, you can either win the pawn by putting so much pressure on it that the other side can't defend it, or you can convert the pressure into activity. This next game is a good example of how you can use the isolated queen pawn to create attacking chances. Now, there's actually a really good video that does an amazing job at covering this game, and I linked that in the study, and so I won't be going into too much depth here, just highlighting the main points of how you can use the isolated queen pawn to your advantage. Going forward just a little bit, we can see that after this move c takes d4, there's actually e takes d4, and white voluntarily gives themselves an isolated queen pawn. And if we fast forward just a little bit, we can kind of see why. After this move rook to e1, we can see that there's pressure along the e file. White is going to play knight to e5 when the time presents itself, and the two bishops have open lines towards the king side. Going a little further forward, we can see there's this move queen to d3, lining up a battery towards the h7 square. Because of this battery, black plays g6, creating some dark square weaknesses and allowing for this move bishop to h6. Now, if you're wondering why black didn't just play some other move like rook c8 to try and improve, we see this important strike d5, and after e takes d5, the e file is open, allowing for a nice tactical sequence. Bishop g5 threatening to take and then take on h7, and so there's this move g6 now, blunting the battery. However, after this nice tactical sequence, rook takes e7, queen takes e7, knight takes d5, you are actually winning a lot of material here as white. And so black allows bishop to h6. Going forward just a little bit, we can see that after black plays this move knight to d5, offering a trade of the c3 knight, white plays knight to e4, declining a trade, not wanting to get closer to an endgame, wanting to keep pieces on the board so that there are more attacking chances. Even further forward, we can see here after bishop f8, instead of playing queen h3 or something like that, white plays this move bishop to g5, avoiding the trade here. However, after bishop e7, white trades here because of this move. Bishop takes d5, and after pawn takes, there's knight f6, getting into the black position, only trading for a concrete tactical reason. And now after king to g7, white plays this nice move queen to h3, and we can see how the knight being on e5, supported by the isolated queen pawn, well, at this point the queen pawn is no longer isolated, but being supported by the pawn on d4, we can see that after king takes f6, there's this nice move knight to g4, very important, and after the king comes back, there's queen h6 and knight to f6, showing how this knight, which was on e5, becomes a crucial attacking piece. Now, that didn't happen in the game went on a few more moves, white kept up the attack, and black ended up losing in the end. However, I think just what we've seen so far, we can see how white uses the isolated queen pawn to generate some attacking chances. Moving on from the isolated queen pawn, we reach the section about the backwards pawn. And I'd like to use a line in this Sveshnikov Sicilian to show how the backwards pawn can arise, and just a little bit about how the opposing side can maybe play against it. Going forward a little bit, we can see that after this e5 move here, both the d6 and d5 squares are not controlled by a pawn. And after this knight db5 move threatening knight d6, black plays d6, and this d6 pawn is a backwards pawn. Now, by definition, a backwards pawn is one that's not defended by any pawns, but is adjacent to a friendly pawn. However, it cannot be moved without the loss of material, allowing it to be pressured. In this case, we can see that the d6 pawn is backwards, since if it were to move to d5, it would just easily get captured by white. As such, if we go forward to this position, we can see, first thing that's important right here, white plays this move, bishop takes f6, removing a defender of the d5 square, and then moving further forward, c4, defending this d5 square, and a little bit later, after knight to c2, we can see white's plan is to control the d5 square as much as possible, right in front of the backwards pawn, so that it can no longer trade itself off and stays backwards. White will then increase the pressure along the d file and hope to win that pawn in the future, or force black to allocate a lot of resources to defending it. This next game is going to show how to play against a backwards pawn. If we fast forward a little bit, we can see that after this trade here on c6, there's this move b takes c6, and even though it doesn't look like it since you can play c5, the c pawn is backwards since the d5 pawn is too weak. We'll now see how white spends some time to control the square in front of the pawn, first with the knight, and then with the bishop, and then with the rook, and the rook also adds some direct pressure to the pawn itself. And a few moves later, we see the move bishop c5 blockading the pawn and fully immobilizing it, especially since in this position right here, black could potentially play c5 since now d5 is sufficiently defended. So again, blockading, and if we move forward a little bit, we can see after trading the queen to d4, controlling the square in front of the pawn yet again. If we move forward, there's this move e3, which opens up the bishop's eyes towards the diagonal, attacking the queen currently. However, it also opens up the rook that's on f2, and we'll see in just a few moves, after the knight lands on this square, again blockading, and there's this trade, this move rook to c2, adding more pressure along the file. And we saw something similar in the game looking at the isolated queen pawn and how to play against it, where the queen and both of the rooks were all in the same file, pressuring this one pawn, forcing the opposing side to allocate a lot of resources to defending it. And after this move by black, we can see here that white does something very instructive, playing b4. And just like in that game with the isolated queen pawn yet again, there's a pin along the c file right behind the weak pawn. And so by pushing the pawn from b4 to b5, you can add even more pressure to it. If we go forward just a few more moves, black plays rook to b8, trying to gain some counterplay, since if you maybe take on b6 or just take on a6 right away, it seems like you're winning a pawn and you're cashing in somewhat. However, after queen takes b4, what ends up happening is black gets a lot more counterplay than is necessary, and so white plays this important move a3, just limiting black's counterplay, not allowing black to actually get out of this bind. We can also see how this game could get even more miserable for black, since after queen takes here, there's this move e takes d4, and the pawn cannot move at all. The c5 square is just so heavily controlled, and white would just win this simply. Anyhow, after this move a3, black plays rook to a7, trying to defend this pawn. However, this allows a nice tactical shot, rook takes c6, and finally white is cashing in. After queen takes rook, there is queen takes rook here, and this game ended up being a smooth victory from here on out. Looking back at the important points in this game, and also how white played against the backwards pawn, we first look at this knight a4 move, controlling the square, then bishop to e3, then later bishop to c5, blockading the pawn, and if we look even further forward, we can see there's this knight to c5 move, blockading yet again, and then also this b4 move, using the pin along the file to potentially, or in this case, threatening to open up the file and thus goading black into playing a6. However, you can actually use the pin to use your pawn to put even more pressure on the backwards pawn than was already there. This next game focuses on playing against the hanging pawns structure, as highlighted here. The hanging pawns is an isolated pair of pawns that can be frozen and thus targeted by the opposing side. Now, while this game is very famous and there are a lot of intricacies I could go over, I'm mainly going to focus on looking at how Bobby Fischer played against these hanging pawns. First, we can see if we go forward a few moves, there is this trade right here on e6 and then this move e4. And notice if d takes e4, these pawns are all split. Black's pawn structure is ruined, now having 4 isolated pawns that will all be picked off fairly easily. However, after black plays d4, we can see here that the pawns are on the same color complex. And once they're on the same color, you can prevent both of them moving by controlling the squares in front of them. In this case, the c4 and d3 squares. The light square bishop does an especially good job of that since it controls the entire diagonal. And since these pawns can't move, Fischer is starting to make some expedition on the king side, preparing to move some attacking forces over there, making use of the space advantage that the e5 pawn gives him. Crucially, in this position, black had this really nice knight b6 move, which protects the queen. If we look back just one move, we can see how the pawn on c5 is pinned to the queen currently, and we can see the knight controls c4, potentially allowing the pawns to move. And after rook to b8, there's this move bishop to c4, blockading the pawns and making sure that the entire queen side is frozen. Crucially, this move knight to b6 doesn't work in this position because white has a strong move queen to b3, attacking the e6 pawn and pinning the knight to the rook on b8. This bishop that's on c4 also does a good job targeting the e6 pawn and eventually becomes a very important attacking piece. Going forward just a few moves, we can see white play b3, further solidifying the bishop's outpost on c4, and now allowing white to focus completely on attacking the king. Fischer's attack ended up being successful and he won the game. However, the important moves in this game were first after e4, d4, and these pawns were on this color complex and now could be blockaded and frozen. And also this expansion of f4, then e5, where Fischer took as much space as he could and now is able to transfer his pieces over to the king side and begin an attack. And finally, we'll take a look at a technique designed to induce some weaknesses in your opponent's pawn structure, the minority attack. The minority attack is characterized by this 2 versus 3 on the queen side, where we can see white has the A and B pawns, and black has these A, B, and C pawns with the C pawn advanced 1 square. It doesn't necessarily need to be exactly like this, however this is the general characteristic structure. Here white plays a move that looks kind of strange, rook A to B1. However, within the context of the minority attack, it makes a lot of sense. The idea is to then play b4 and b5. If we go forward just a few moves, we can see b4 here, with the goal of attacking the c6 pawn, and either trading on c6 and leaving a backwards pawn there, or if for some reason black decides to take on b5, that would leave the d5 pawn very weak. Here black stops his b5 push, however white just plays a4, and this next move plays b5. Let's say first off black were to try and ignore this minority attack. There's this move b takes a6, and after b takes a6 we can see the a pawn is now isolated and potentially a target, and we can see that the c6 pawn is now backwards, since if the c6 pawn moves then d5 falls. However, if we go back and we see a takes b5, a takes b5, if black for some reason even thought to play c takes b5, we can see how all of these pawns are now weak, and there would be knight takes d5 to follow. Black's position is completely busted. So instead of that, black usually ignores this, and after taking here, we can see black taking here, and now this c6 pawn is backwards and can be targeted. And just as another example of how the minority attack can be used in game, here after this move rook a to c1, we can see that there's all of this pressure on the c7 pawn, and so black logically played c6. However, this pawn's now a hook and can be targeted by the minority attack. White very quickly plays b4, looking to play b5 and create some weaknesses. Going forward a few moves, we can see this move a6 to prevent b5, and so if we just keep on going forward, there's a4 to renew this idea of playing b5. And after a little bit more jostling, we do see this b5 move happen right here, threatening to ruin black's pawn structure by either taking on c6 or taking on a6. Then there's a series of trades, and after all of these trades, we can see that black is left with an isolated b pawn on starting square, so very far back. It's not an asset as a passed pawn, and so white has the opportunity to just target it for the rest of the game, and black is forced to allocate resources defending it. Because of this, white ended up winning a fairly smooth game, where the combination of this b7 pawn weakness and the pawn on d4 being an asset for white ended up being too much for black to handle. And with that game, we've reached the end of the chapter, end of the video. First, we looked at how pawns can provide a useful space advantage that can lead to open lines and attacking chances for your pieces. Next, we briefly touched on pawn breaks in more closed positions. Then we looked at the plans that arise in positions with an isolated queen pawn, backwards pawn, or the hanging pawn structures. And lastly, we looked at how you can induce pawn weaknesses in your opponent's position with the minority attack. All of the games featured in this video are in a study that is linked in the description, and subscribe to know when the next video comes out.